Hello everyone. Today we are looking at barriers to critical thinking. And we are going to kind of take a look through the various things that can prevent one from using critical thinking. And this is important as we get into like the actual breakdown of different techniques and aspects of critical thinking, to keep these in mind, because if you're going and learning, like, this is the techniques and these are the different styles for critical thinking and here's the processes for that, and you don't kind of have in the back of your mind the barriers that can impede that, it's easy to sometimes slip into these, especially because they're with any of these, what we're going to be looking at, a lot of them would be like, oh yeah, well, those are small things. And it can be. All of these things, these barriers to critical thinking that we're going to be looking at, can be very small things that are not relevant in terms of the decision you make for certain things. And then at the same aspect or same side of that, it can be the other end, which is it can be significantly impactful to your decision making, depending on what it is. So we're gonna look probably at the examples I'm going to talk about are kind of more lighthearted, but they end up applying when you take them further into more important decisions that require critical thinking. So it's something to think about. These are things that we all do. As we go through these, you hopefully should recognize a lot of these as things like, oh yeah, I do that. Oh yeah, that comes up, because we do. Especially, and again, for small things, it doesn't matter. But when it's a more important, larger decision, and you're trying to use critical thinking, if we are, utilizing these in our day-to-day life for small things, it's super easy to creep in for those larger things as well. So if they're always in the back of your mind, then it's something you can reassess and be, okay, hold up, wait a minute, let's take a look at these types of things. So that's why we're looking at barriers to critical thinking kind of first, and then getting into the processes and details and specifics of what it means to critically think. So let's go to the next slide here. All right, so there are tons of things that make critical thinking hard. We're constantly bombarded by information, emotions, relationships, concerns, the news, social media, busyness of life. Everything it sometimes feels like the world is all designed, life maybe more than the world, life is designed to prevent you from critically thinking. Or at least certainly be a blockade in that process. And it kind of creates a situation and scenario where it's hostile to critical thinking at times. And so it's important that we understand, as I mentioned, those things, because it really is, it's not set up, especially with the age of the internet and social media, the 24-hour news cycle, just how tuned in we are to constant, rapid information. I think that's key. Is that the world has always been somewhat hostile to critical thinking, but the modern world even more so, because of the rapid pace of information, news, the social media outlets that are designed to create fake news and pranks and disinformation on a regular basis, advertising, all of that stuff is just even more of a barrier than it used to be before those things existed. So we get the benefits of the modern world, but we also get the downsides of it. So if we look at the definition of critical thinking, one of them, remember I gave you a list, one of those definitions was the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. And right, that if that's the one of the definitions that we're looking at, then it means that there's several things that can go wrong in the ability to critical think just from breaking down that definition. So the first is right here with if the process is not systematic, if it's not true evaluation or formulation, and if it ignores rational standards. Right? If any one of these three, I'm going to change the color here in a minute. I didn't mean for it to be red. If any of these three things are disrupted, then critical thinking has been disrupted at some point. So there's several things right there that have to take place that can easily be broken in that stage. Now, there's two main categories that impede critical thinking here. That is those that are based on how we think, and then those that are based on what we think. So for how we think, that is, this is more of the, and again, sorry for the red here, psychological factors. This can be fear, anger, passion, the emotions, right? I should have said emotions instead of listing off all the emotions. It can be emotions, but it can be motivations, right? It can be experiences. It can be also group pressure, peer pressure. So we'll say group pressure, right? The desire to conform puts it into that, right? It's how we think about things within them. What we think about is more of this idea of a world view. And there are certain worldviews that are, by their nature, impediments upon critical thinking. And so then there's more than the list that I've provided. We're going to look at three philosophical beliefs that impede that. And there's more than that in that sense with that. But certainly skepticism is a big one. This idea of relativism, individual or social relativism, are the three that we're going to be looking at there. And those are the kind of philosophies on life. Like, I believe the world works this way, and so with this worldview, this is how I'm going to proceed and think about things, right? The other, of course, is stereotypes and biases play into that as well. And bias, right? So these are the ones where, again, it's what we think about how the world kind of functions, and how people function to that degree that impedes it, versus the more psychological connection of things that put pressures on us, that can cause our thinking to temporarily change, right? Because you're not angry, hopefully, 24/7. So when you are angry, you're more likely to not think critically. But that isn't a constant state of being for hopefully everyone, or at least the majority of people. So that's the difference between how and what in terms of that. All right, I'm going to change the pen color real fast. All right, I think I've got it changed now. There are, when these things, like I said, these things don't happen, or when we have these types of views, it can prevent critical thinking. But there are ways to work around these barriers. One is just being aware of them, right? And the key to this really has to do with being able to detect errors in our thinking, right? If you aren't aware of these, if you're not aware of this stuff going on, this becomes really hard to do, right? Because if you don't know it exists, or you don't know it's a thing, it becomes harder to recognize. And maybe you recognize, like, okay, something's wrong, but I don't know what it is. The other thing, of course, is being able to essentially restrain our emotions, which is very hard to do as well, especially in the heat of the moment, which isn't really necessarily the expectation. People are going to be sad and passionate and angry. It goes back to detecting these errors in our thinking and recognizing that, and coming back to it in a time when that passion and emotion is not as strong. And certainly achieving a level of objectivity. Be objective. Or reminding yourself to be objective, essentially. When we start doing these things, restraining our emotions, being objective, being able to detect when we are thinking illogically, then we can overcome these barriers in a much more frequent or better way. So the first thing we're going to look at, and it has a couple subsets underneath it, is self-interested thinking. And the three, so we're looking at, and it's self-interested thinking, but then we're going to talk a little bit about what self-interested thinking is, then personal and emotional involvement, and then saving face. Right? So self-interested thinking is, just as it's pretty self-explanatory, I think, in terms of the name. It's when you think about yourself and your interest first. Again, and actually, and I'm going to probably say this with every single one of these, that is not inherently a bad thing to think about yourself. In fact, some people need to think about themselves more. The problem arises when we use our own self-interest to supersede everything else, right? And as it says here, we accept the claims for no other reason than favoring our viewpoints and interest, or believe ourselves to be more important. It really is two parts here, right? That we accept claims for another reason because of favoring our viewpoints and interest, or we believe we're more important than others. Both of those fit into self-interested thinking. And there are definitely people who the self-interested thinking is always about seeing themselves as more important and better than everyone else. So therefore, whatever their opinion, whatever their decision, whatever their view is clearly the right one because they're superior to everyone else. More often than not, for the majority of people, it's the sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious decision making based on what is going to be the best choice for myself, in a sense like that. Yes, it's super tempting to make a decision based on what serves your own self-interest, because it's what you want. It's what helps you. Of course, that sounds, your first gut reaction is to be like, oh, of course that's the right decision, because that's what's best for me. Sometimes it is, if you continue with the critical thinking process and go through the structures. Other times it's not. And it can be really hard to recognize that in terms of when that's happening. So you have, for example, and it's very common in businesses, CEOs, companies, politicians constantly do this, where they make decisions based on what's the best interest of themselves, not their constituents, not the U.S. as a whole, not the world as a whole, not for the company as a whole. Sometimes you see CEOs sometimes make really important decisions for the company and the direction it goes, and who it ended up benefiting was them, not the company itself, right? And those are examples of self-interested not only thinking, but then decision making in that process. This can include wishful thinking, cherry picking information, maintaining an illusion of control, or overly optimistic thinking. I'm just going to keep thinking everything's going to turn out all right because that's what I want to have happen, which is also wishful thinking in that process too. And then I'll make a decision based on what is the most positive outcome, right? Or again, I'm going to make this decision because that's what I really, really want to have happen, rather than looking at it critically and whether it's the best decision in mind. And then, of course, people just making decisions based on the idea that this benefits me. So examples, I believe the city should lower property taxes because enough money goes to the local schools already, and I own a home and have no children, so I should not have to pay taxes that go to the schools. So if you think about that example, right? Okay, so if you're making an argument of like, I'm going to make a decision to vote against higher property taxes, or I'm going to make a decision to vote for lower property taxes. Let's put it with the example, it fits better that way. I'm going to vote to lower property taxes, and the reason I'm choosing this is because I believe enough money goes to the schools, and I own a home, which some of those taxes goes to the schools, the property taxes goes to the schools, and I don't have any kids. So there's no reason I should have to pay property taxes, or at least there's no reason I should have to pay higher property taxes or the same level of property tax when I don't have kids that go to school, which was what some of that money benefits. So, sorry, that was super convoluted, but hopefully you got the idea of that, right? This idea that essentially I'm making a decision about voting for lowering property taxes based solely on the self-interested view that I don't want to pay higher taxes. No one does, or very few people do, except for maybe some very rich people who, which that's a good example. We'll use that. The normal thing to say would be like, no one's going to vote for higher property taxes or wants it. And there are people who vote for higher property taxes. Actually, a good number of people. Nobody wants higher property taxes. That's probably a more true statement. Even people who vote for it. Yeah, I don't really want to pay more, but I understand the reasoning behind it and the benefit that it brings. So I'm willing to pay a little bit more. But you do have, well, a lot of really, like the billionaires and multimillionaires often don't pay a ton of taxes and continue to utilize all the advantages to continue doing that. There are a select few of these uber wealthy people who have constantly been promoting for higher taxes, this isn't property tax, just general tax, higher taxes for the wealthy, which is making a decision that goes against their own self-interest, right? Because their own self-interest would be to say, no, I'm going to keep exploiting and using these loopholes because I'm wealthy to keep paying way less taxes than even a good chunk of people who are way, don't have millions, right? It's ridiculous when it's the people who have like no money are paying more taxes than a multimillionaire or billionaire. But of course, the self-interested view is to say, keep it as is, keep the status quo. It's good for me. But you do have these people that are advocates for significantly higher taxes on multimillionaires and billionaires, and it would impact them financially. Well, that's because they're not using self-interested thinking to make the decision, but are rather actually using critical thinking to walk through that process of what's actually best, what's the best choice for taxes. Well, what are the taxes doing? Who do they benefit? Why are they needed? And if you go through those, right, then saying, well, all these billionaires not paying taxes is actually very negative to the rest of the population. Oops, sorry, I hit the table there. The rest of the population, the United States in general, and so then they're actually usually using critical thinking rather than self-interested thinking. Another example of self-interested thinking, I'm against all forms of gun control because I am a hunter, right? Again, it's this idea of I am only against gun control because I'm a hunter, which is the self-interested thinking. You can still make an argument for why you're against gun control, but if your reasoning and basis is just because it benefits you, or it's because it's connected to what you do, that's the issue with that, right? Another one, the university should not raise tuition because I'm a student and I don't want to pay more tuition, right? That's not critical thinking. You can still end up critically thinking about making a good argument for why the university shouldn't raise tuition, but if your whole argument to make that decision is because I'm a student and I don't want to pay more, then you have not used critical thinking. So this idea with that of again picking and choosing things based on your own benefit rather than looking for evidence to support your views, or what even happens sometimes, which this one could be like another one on here, ignore evidence when it goes against your own self-interest, right? So that this goes even further, right? You aren't just not looking for specific evidence, which is usually, I think, a lot of times what self-interested thinking is it's a snap judgment on, oh, that benefits me, that's my decision. But some people go further and actually ignore evidence that goes against their own self-interest. You could do this sometimes with, with silly things in the sense of like, I need to make a decision, and I'm going to, instead of, so I'm going to research it, right? I was going to say flip a coin, but that's not, there's no critical thinking in that. I'm going to research it, and then I don't like what I find, so I keep researching until I find that one perspective that fits what I want, right? So that I've manufactured the evidence so that I can say, see, here's the evidence to prove that this decision, which benefits me, is the best choice. Well, you're just faking information essentially while pretending to critically think because you ignored all of the other evidence that suggests this, right? I don't like that conclusion or answer, so I'm going to find something that actually reinforces what I want. That is that type of thing. And again, I think that's the more insidious view of that, when the more common is just not going further. Now, the next part is personal and emotional involvement. Not surprisingly, when there is strong personal emotional feelings involved in making a decision, it is very likely to impede critical thinking. I like this quote because I think it's a good reminder of how that kind of emotional pull plays into our decision making, and why it's always a good idea that if you're overly emotional, that you try to wait to make important critical decisions that require critical thinking if you can. There's obviously times where you can't, but even just recognizing it is important. But it certainly is a better decision if you can recognize it and then say, okay, I need to not be making this decision right now because I'm too emotionally invested in it. So this is from philosopher Bertrand Russell. When there are rational grounds for an opinion, people are content to set them forth and wait for them to operate. In such cases, people do not hold their opinions with passion. They hold them calmly and set forth their reasons quietly. The opinions that are held with passion are always for those which no good ground exists. Indeed, the passion is the measure of the holder's lack of rational conviction. So this idea, and you could argue against this in terms of that there are no good grounds that exist if you're passionate about something, but in making the point that people who are not as passionately involved or emotionally involved, or at least can set it aside, because you can be very passionate about a topic and still not have that be where your argument is coming from. Those are the people who, again, can hold them calmly and set forth their reasons quietly. People who it's all about passion, right, are the ones that don't have no good grounds exist. This idea that then those are the people who don't actually have, all their arguments are based on trying to sway you emotionally. And that's actually another good example of when someone is making an argument to you and they're trying to persuade you of something, assessing how what is the appeal. Are they giving good factual information, or are they appealing to you based on fear, based on an urgency, based on something that's going to get you riled up so that you make an emotional decision? Politicians do this all the time. They play on emotions. Advertising does this all the time, where they play on emotions and stuff. The goal is, right, to get you reacting emotionally rather than actually logically breaking down the different processes and things like that. Right, so being able to recognize these signs of anything that is creating anger, fear, passion, right, that those things are going to impede your ability to critically think and or recognize if that's being thrown at you, then that person probably doesn't actually have a good argument that they're just using. So again, here's where it's innocent, where our emotions play into it and we get caught up in it, versus insidious, where someone intentionally uses that emotional connection to get you to support their view without actually critically thinking about what it is. And you see it all the time. Politicians who are making these claims and there's no foundation for anything they're saying. And they're couching it in terms that are all based on strong emotions, and playing off of people's fears and concerns, hoping that then they will support them or vote for them or their position based on creating essentially an irrational fear of a situation, rather than going, okay, but why is this what you're supporting? And if you actually break down that, you realize that whatever they're promoting is crap and that they don't have an argument. That's why they're using that emotional investment to get you. People who people who are passionate about an argument, if they have used critical thinking, can provide that information, right? Again, it's then based on your reaction as well. So it's important not for only our reaction and how we are feeling when we're making decisions, but when people are trying to get you to make decisions and are throwing this at you as well. That needs to play into it. And then there's just a general personal structure to it. If something is really personal to you, it usually comes with that emotional involvement. It's important to step back and think about, why am I making this decision? Because I know this person, because this person reminds me of someone that's important to me, because I have been fighting for this cause for this long, and this person's saying that they'll do it this way, and that cause is important to me, so therefore I immediately am drawn to it, right? And that is also an aspect of that as well. All right, the next slide, if I can get the mouse over, is saving face. Decisions can also be made because you're attempting to avoid looking bad or wrong. Again, this can be silly. I always think of like if you trip when you're walking down the road or a hallway, and then you decide to play it off like you intended to do that, right? Like it was a joke, or you were, walking a funny way for a reason, right? Well, that's harmless, and there's not a lot of critical thinking that matters in that at all. But that is an attempt to save face, minor, and stuff that way, right? To avoid embarrassment, to avoid looking stupid, to avoid if there's a fear of if you want people to view you in a certain way. And so then you make a decision or opinion based on trying to make sure that they continue to see you that way, then that's saving face. Again, a lot of little things for saving face are irrelevant in the long run, but there are bigger things that become problematic. This is especially true where I see it impede people the most are those that have constructed their identity around a specific idea or person. And to such a point, as it says here, that they cannot accept alternate viewpoints, right? If your whole identity or a lot of your identity has shaped around this idea, or again, a person, it can be a person too, it doesn't have to just be an idea, then what happens is people will not only refuse to accept alternate viewpoints or evidence that proves that they're wrong, but they'll dig deeper into their beliefs when provided with facts that show that their viewpoints are not accurate. Right, and this moves beyond self-interest at points. So this one's incredibly harming. Because what happens with this, right, is if you get so entrenched in, like, my entire identity is wrapped around this one thing and this one viewpoint, this one person, and then I am told, look, here's a bunch of facts and data and information that show why this person is bad, or why this idea is harmful. That there's little things. When they first introduced seatbelts, they didn't have their identity wrapped around this. But people got really entrenched in with like, oh, seatbelts are stupid and horrible and not helpful and stuff like that. But it's even worse if your identity is tied around this. Cults utilize this big time. Cult leaders, people will wrap their entire identity around a cult leader. And so even when they're presented with facts about how this person is super harmful, look, the things that they're teaching you, this is just absolutely false. What they're saying is not true. It does not happen. It doesn't matter if their entire identities around that. Not only will they again refuse to accept these viewpoints, but they will usually fight back with essentially attacking the people who are giving them this information. They will also, and in order to save face, because if you crumble your whole identity, it's psychologically impactful, and it's hard for people to do. And so rather than have to deal with digging out how you shaped your entire life and identity around this person or event, again, if you think like cult leader, and how wrong you were, you now have to fight, well, I that would mean I look really stupid. It would mean I have wasted my life or a portion of my life. It would mean I look like a fool. It would mean that how was I conned into this? And some people cannot handle that. And rather than admit those things, they will continue to dig deeper and eventually move in on attack and fight back and attack those that are trying to provide them with that information. And you see it again, you see it all the time within these cults. When you talk to people who eventually get out of the cults, I mean, they even talk about having to deprogram people because of the level of investment. That again, it moves beyond just decisions based on self-interest to almost decisions of survival in their mind. That I have nothing because of the decisions and my identity wrapped around this. There is the thought process is there is nothing left if I accept these other things. So I will deny and assume that all of these things are made up, that people are trying to trick me, that they're evil. I will go on the attack and try to tear them down. I will try to destroy them, right? There have been people who have ended up killing people in cults because of essentially what comes down and boils down to the absolute need to save face. Now, again, that is a super extreme example, and there's other psychological aspects going on, but it does highlight how dangerous some of these can be. Again, they can be extremely harmful. It can be very silly or simple things to extremely harmful things, depending on the level and what is going on and what is taking place. Again, the more common aspect of this is just that we want people to see us a certain way. I want people to think of me as intelligent. I want people to think of me as nice or kind or caring or beautiful or a good mom, or whatever other thing you've constructed as important to your identity, to who you are, to how people view you. And so we are more likely to accept claims and make decisions that cover, that fit and align with those, that with our views, right? That will reinforce these things that say, no, this is why I've made this, this decision because it fits with that worldview. You're also more likely to accept things that are wrong if it reinforces those views as well. The other things that can happen with this is that sometimes people, if they make a mistake, in order to avoid embarrassment, they'll blame someone else. So instead of accepting responsibility or realizing that decision was not the correct one, or that you just did something incorrect, instead it's someone else's fault, or it's something else that caused you to do that. Like you didn't mean to, like the tripping, right? Again, that's a non-dangerous thing, but I don't blame myself for tripping or just acknowledge it happened and move on. I pretend that I didn't trip. And in fact, I was just doing a funny little walk dance down the way to be funny. Right, that it's almost that kind of delusional structure. If you behave badly, then you try to justify that behavior in order to save face, so that people don't think that that your behavior is unacceptable, or you make decisions or actions that try to suggest that the badly behaving aspect of what you're doing isn't actually bad. You make judgments or observations that turn out to be wrong. but you're too proud or embarrassed to admit it. So again, you dig in to that. Anything that's like rationalizing, making excuses. The other that's a little more subtle is you play up the positives and ignore the negatives of something. Or the opposite, that you play up the negatives and ignore the positives. Refusing to admit any mistake, refusing to examine information, evidence, are all ways that critical thinking ends up being ignored in order to save face. This can be done in a way where it's obvious to others, where everyone can see what you're doing, even if you have kind of deluded yourself into thinking they can't. But this can be very subtle as well. So people who are really good at this, and again, depends on the situation. If you're in a cult that the majority of the world realizes is like, hey, they murder people in this cult and we all have seen it, it's not going to be subtle in that sense. But if it's something that is not obviously a cult, and you give, you make decisions and you provide arguments to people that have a hint of truth or structure that connects with them, you may not notice it. You may not notice it in yourself, right? That's the issue and problem with self-interested thinking in any of these subsets, is that it's hard to recognize sometimes if it's subtle, because it benefits us and we are naturally inclined to go that way. And I'm like, well, if it's good for me, why is it a bad thing, right? If this is beneficial, maybe I take out the me and just say, if it's beneficial, why is it a bad thing? So again, just to know, it can be the extreme version, or it can be the subtle version of that. So the consequences of self-interested thinking. And we talked about a couple, right? I mean, it can be self-destructive, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Ultimately, self-interested thinking does prevent careful evaluation and critical thinking. It allows you to be blinded to the facts. This is a big one, blinded to the facts. And the blinded to the facts makes it super easy for people to be duped by propaganda or manipulation. Those who manipulate people, those who push propaganda, love it when people get so invested in self-interested thinking that it becomes really easy to convince them of whatever you want. If you think about this in this term of if you you become easy to control, is essentially what this is, right? This is easy to control because all they have to do is tell you what you want to hear. And if they can twist whatever it is for their agenda to connect to what you want to hear, and that then convinces you to agree with them or support them or give them money or do whatever, you've been manipulated. And that's how propaganda and people who are trying to manipulate people, that's what they play off of. Again, there's levels of this, but the more that you are blinded to those facts because you're solely focused on what is going to benefit you, the more that you are likely to then be easily controlled, because like I said, all it takes is someone telling you what you want to hear, for you to then go with whatever it is that they're wanting. And as soon as you've done that a couple of times, it's just easy to repeat over and over again because it's a reinforcing cycle. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Once you start thinking that way, once you start diving into the depths of that, it's hard. It's actually really hard to get out of on bigger things. Again, the more that it's connected to your identity and who you assume yourself to be, the harder it is to be removed from that. That's why cults are so insidious with that, because they dive into your identity and who you see yourself as and what you see as beneficial for yourself. And it gets so entrenched, it's really hard to get people out of it. But this can be done in other realms as well, not just with occult. The other thing with this is that when you put too much emphasis on your own views and perceptions over critical thinking, you're likely to miss things. So again, not as self-destructive as the propaganda and manipulation, but what happens is that whether it's intentional missing or not, we're more likely to, not see evidence or find other things that would be important to make a fully fledged decision that's been, researched and understood based on critical thinking. You either selectively or unconsciously skip over little details or things, sometimes big, because you're only looking for what is going to be connected to your self-interest. Again, this can be unconscious, so it doesn't always have to be intentional, right? It can be unconscious or consciously. It depends on what you're doing. It can be intentional or unintentional. And this is where this gets into this idea of how our experiences often come into this play. And because again, if we're using what we're thinking about, well, my experience, and this is what I know, it can play into this as well. Our experiences are usually a mix of actual events or memory and fabrications or gaps that are filled in by the brain. So our own desires and expectations often help form a significant proportion of our perceptions. And where this comes into play with this is our desires and expectations, right? There's that self-interested want. And this then impacts perceptions, memories, and beliefs. And these are examples of how this has this consequence to be a negative impact. Memory is a tricky thing, and actually just even as we're processing in the moment too. When we're looking at, so let's say you look at a scene, and you're looking at a scene, what we're actually seeing versus what our brain is filling in is different. Our eyes can only take in so much, and our brain fills in the remainder based on an expectation of what you expect to be there. So the thing with that is, though, that's not always the case of what is there, right? If our brain is filling in the rest based on experiences from our beliefs and past experiences, if we have only been using self-interested thinking, and this actually gets in, and this works exactly with stereotype and biases as well, by the way. So that this could be with both looking at self-interested thinking. This is also a consequence of stereotyping and biases. But this idea of that, right, we fill it in with that stress and trauma can impact memory as well. But an example of this is we expect to see a gun in the hand of a bank robber, and we witness this event. We may remember seeing the bank robber with a gun when in fact they never had a gun, right? And then we've convinced ourselves that is what actually took place. But if your brain is tricking yourself, and then it's based on these desires or wants or expectations, you have to realize that self-interested thinking is playing off of all of those things. And so it's inherently untrustworthy in many cases. There's other examples of this. I'm going to show you a video. I'm going to turn this sound down because I don't want them to copyright it. And I'll just kind of talk over it. So that I don't want them to copyright it and then have this be an issue with the video here. So let me end this, keep that. We'll go to here. Okay, so let's look at this one first. I'm going to skip through a couple parts of this. So we'll show this first part here. And so you see this person, you're looking at this person, pay attention to what he does. He gets up and the phone's ringing and he answers the phone. Okay, now did you notice anything off? Watch again. So they're going to show it again. There he is typing, phone rings, he gets up, over there, answering the phone. What's the change? Well, if you didn't notice, there's a couple changes. One is a collared shirt versus, if we go here, no collared shirt. But the bigger change is it's a different person, right? But your brain, especially because they're wearing mostly the same clothes, here I'll show it again, expects that your brain fills in the expectation that if we're seeing this of this person here, we hear the phone ring. Now, you don't hear the phone ring because I muted it, but you hear the phone ring and then you see a person picking up what appears to be the ringing phone with the same general color and style of clothing. We make the assumption that this is the same person, and your brain just goes past that. There is another example here where they do this experiment where if there, and this actually goes into cognitive overload too. So these examples are ones that actually kind of fit into several of the areas. But in this experiment here, what they're going to do is that they're going to be talking to a person asking for directions, or actually I think they're talking about some important, like we're signing a petition or something like that. The group's going to come in and distract by walking this big mirror or board in between them. And while they do that, the person's going to change and it's going to be a different person. And they said that like 7 out of the 15 times that they did this, people didn't notice. So there are people who notice, right? But there are plenty of people who don't. And this experiment's been done many times. So I'll show you here where you can see that he stops and is talking to the person. And as they're talking, the people are going to come in here in just a second with the big board. Go in between them. He grabs it. The other person replaces and keeps talking. And they don't notice, right? And then this guy does notice. See, so, but that, the fact that so many of these times, and they didn't even try, if you look at if you go here, let's look back at this one. Who's talking first? He has a black hat, pants, a bag. Now they have shorts, a different colored hat, no bag. So they didn't even try to be tricky about it in this example where they were wearing, like the first example, they're wearing the same clothes almost. Here, it's very different clothing and people were still not noticing. Some of that's just how much you pay attention to stuff and think about things. But some of it's the brain, because they're talking to someone, they have an expectation when that board moves away that person's still going to be there. And when they're not, your brain just filters that in, right, with that. And here's another one. And in this one, the goal is to count how many passes does the team in white make. So as you're looking at this, hopefully you're counting how many times that the white team is making the pass. Pay attention to the white team and how often that they are passing. Now it's harder. I'm making it harder because I'm talking. But the other aspect is they're saying it's 13 passes. They asked how many. However, did you see when you were looking at this, they said a bear right there walking through the scene. Now, depending on how you were viewing this when I was talking, because ideally you would watch it and you would concentrate solely on counting the balls and not listening to me talking with it. And if you were focused on counting, then there was a good chance that you would not see the bear in this case. The original experiment that they recorded was with a gorilla walking by. But the reality is a lot of people miss it. Because again, our brain filters that out because it's not expected. But it also goes with the fact that you're being given a task that you have to focus on. So this is why this fits into cognitive overload when we get to that in a minute. But the idea with this is it also is what I have the self-interest of what I'm trying to do with this is the idea with self-interest is that our own self-interest is flawed in the sense that we are likely to our brain is likely to filter out things and just ignore them. So again, this is where the intentional versus unintentional, because we're not considering it, right? My brain is not expecting a gorilla And if I'm only focusing on self-interested thinking, my brain is not expecting or thinking that there's these other things that could come into play and give me a different decision or perspective. And so it too often, like I said, that our brain screws with us essentially, and you have to take that into consideration. Am I seeing the whole picture? Is the idea with this. And if you're only looking at self-interested thinking, no, you're not seeing the whole picture. But again, when we get to cognitive overload, you'll see why those two examples of those videos fit for that as well. Now, the next one is group thinking, peer pressure. Again, the desire to be part of a group and belong is normal. It is a normal, healthy human thing to not want to be solitary and alone. We should be in groups. We should be with people. That is great. The problem comes when we forego critical thinking in order to belong or conform to a group. That's all of these. Again, all of these are like, hey, this is not bad. This is not normal in a small dose. All of these are bad when they either harm us or prevent us from critical thinking, which can either just be a nuisance or can harm us. So that's the kind of thing that has to be taken into consideration with that, right? Is I don't want anyone thinking like these things are bad, inherently bad by themselves, because they're not. It's only a problem when it impedes our ability to critically think, and the reality that any of these can actually become very negative and destructive if we let them get too far. The group pressure, or group thinking, peer pressure can be especially true for adolescents. Who, in a combination of exploring their independence from families for the first time and are looking for new groups to join, are even more susceptible to falling into the trap of going along with things that the group wants in order to fit in. And of course, the other reason is their brains are just not developed. Right, so how did it switch back? Oh, when I go off of the slide for a second here. It changes the color of the pen. So the two things with this, right, adolescents are especially susceptible. One is just this desire to find new groups outside of the family. The other is, of course, brain development. Their brains are not fully developed. And this goes beyond, this is early adulthood too. Their brains are not fully developed, and their ability to think critically is often clouded by emotions, hormones, the strong desires to form new attachments. Adults have a hard time critically thinking. It's not surprising that kids, it's even harder because their brains are still developing those skills and abilities and pathways to do that successfully. The other thing that, of course, plays a huge role in all of this is going to be, I'll put it down here because it's not with teens specifically, well, actually, you could put it with popularity because that's what it goes with there, so we'll do it with that. So there's different types of group pressure. Peer pressure is just pressure from peers, right? That one's pretty easy. The appeal to popularity. This is the idea of essentially the pressure comes from the mere popularity of a belief. So peer pressure is from people. The appeal of popularity can be an idea or practice, right? It doesn't have to be, it's not an individual or a small group even. It could be, example, the internet, social media is a huge factor in the appeal to popularity. And the viral videos are a good example of this. I don't know why it's doing that weird thing. So viral videos, when I showed you for this assignment, right, the Stanley Cups, the iPhone versus Android are really good examples. They're also a critique on our attachment to consumerism, and actually a lot of these appeal to popularity, we'll say consumption, is connected to things. If I have this thing, I'll be popular. Stanley Cups, for example, they're popular with a large group of people. Who they are most popular with at the moment are actually not adults, but middle school and high school girls mostly, because the new style of cup was meant to appeal to them. And the reason that they all want these is because the idea of having a Stanley Cup makes you popular, right? Or all of the cool kids or those in the in group have a Stanley Cup. And so the people want them, and specifically if you're looking at teens want them simply, they don't care about the cup. They don't know anything about the cup. They did not critically think one iota about the benefits or choice in cup. The only reason these middle school and high school girls are picking the Stanley Cups right now is because they're popular. Now, you could argue that maybe some other people initially, adults, were picking it because they saw it as a good cup because of the way it fitted to the cup holder, the fact that it held stuff cold or hot for a really long time, the straw was convenient, and you can have some of those arguments to make that decision. However, I would argue that the majority of people purchasing Stanley Cups today, including adults, are doing so solely because of the viral videos that have created this idea of the Stanley Cup as the it thing. It is created as popularity. This also goes to peer pressure and social status. If all of my friends have a Stanley Cup, then I need to have one as well. But the thing is that without peer pressure, it doesn't even have to be like pushed on them. You have the social media presented. You see everyone in the group. This is that group pressure part of it, right? You see everyone in the group having one. If you're the only one that doesn't have one, peer pressure comes in if they start laughing at you and making fun of you because you don't have a Stanley Cup. So that's the difference, right? But this doesn't even require that. Most of the time, it's just I see everyone else in my friend group has a Stanley Cup. I need a Stanley Cup. I don't care about anything about the cup. I haven't thought about the cup other than I need it because it's popular, versus I see all the friends have it. I want one, but I still decide not to get one because it's expensive and I don't think I should have to pay that price for a cup. But now my friends are making fun of me for not having that cup. So then I decide to get the cup. Now you have both appeal to popularity and peer pressure coming in to that aspect of it. But it's a really good example because, again, if you look especially, I mean, at everyone, if the fact that people were fighting over the cups and stuff, but if you look at within, I guarantee you no middle school or high school girl thought about anything about the benefits of a Stanley Cup outside of that it was popular. Other people in their peer groups and friend groups had it, and potentially the fear of being made fun of with that peer pressure meant that they needed to have one. And that's it. And then the fact that social media just amplifies this, like, because you've always had peer pressure and popularity within, cliques and schools and ecosystems, if you will. The social media and viral videos have just expanded it to spread faster and to actually reach a larger base, right? In the past, before the internet, something might be popular in one city and not the rest of the world because there's an exposure to it. Viral videos, social media, the internet exposes people to it a lot faster. And if you are, again, like teens are, massive consumers, even if they shouldn't be, of social media for hours and hours on end, it's getting fed into your brain all the time that this is something you need to have, this is something you want to emulate, this is something that's popular, this is something that's cool, this is something I need to have. And then it gets reinforced at school, for example, as well. That's a lot of pressure put on someone for that. The other example, right, was I had to watch was the iPhone versus Android, and shows the lack of critical thinking that goes on, right? The idea that an iPhone is, if you with it, he's just asking those people, which is better, or would you date someone if they had an Android? And the person with the iPhone says no. But how many of those people are able to articulate actually good reasons why? None of them. There maybe one that had a couple with I would concede that FaceTime and is probably actually the most logical reason for that. And then some of the difficulties that the messaging systems between the two create. The majority of the people didn't answer that way. They said because of the bubble color, because they're poor, because there's something that must be off about them, because obviously iPhone is the better phone. But if you ask, why is iPhone the better phone? Because iPhone has done a brilliant job in marketing to appeal to popularity, and then peer pressure comes in. And it's true that within the teen, again, this is why adolescents are more susceptible to this. In high schools and somewhat middle school, but especially by high school, people are excluded from peer groups if they don't have an iPhone. They are not put into text groups. They begin to slowly be excluded from events or activities or being in the know of what's going on or being able to talk with your friends. People are being judged and made fun of for not having an iPhone. Again, especially if you get connected to this idea that somehow having an Android means you don't have money, or you're weird, which is funny because the Android flagships cost more than the iPhone flagships. But that's also, again, that lack of critical thinking, right? The person who said, well, they're poor, they don't have money, they're cheap, they're not good. There's no critical thinking that went on to actually knowing that. That was all based on potentially some preconceived ideas, but based on largely this idea of how the Apple has done a fantastic job marketing the iPhone as the phone that is popular, the phone that is cool, the phone that everyone should have. And Android not being one singular company, right? Many, many different types of phones use Android. So it's harder for them to have a universal appeal the way a singular company like Apple does. But both of those, I think, are really, really, really good examples. One last example with this is with, and I think goes into the appeal to common practice as well, which is the idea of pressure from what groups of people do or how they behave. And all of these group pressures are used to reaffirm their own group as the best, the correct choice, the only choice. This is super common, by the way, in like religion, political parties, generations, social classes, things like that. But another good example of appeal to popularity, and sometimes appeal to common practice and peer pressure, I think it fits in all three, are prank videos. And not all prank videos. Some are harmless fun. Again, this is the theme for this. But there are the prank videos that are people filming. There was someone who filmed them attacking someone and stealing their phone and calling it a prank. There was recently some live streamer, the vlogger, I think they're calling it, that he went to Japan and harassed people, is essentially what he did, all in the name of pranks, to the point that he gets kicked out of Japan and then goes back to Japan later, not that long, like 3 months later, and does it again. And he ends up getting arrested, and he ends up in jail for like 3 months. And I think they decided to send him home again, or the trial may be still going on, but he was in jail for several months because he just straight up is harassing people in the name of calling them pranks. And you could have the argument that it moves beyond pranks, but these are titled as prank videos. So why are people doing this? Because no common sense, let alone critical thinking, is taking place. I'm filming myself committing a crime. If I don't want to get arrested or have other consequences, I probably shouldn't do this. And that's just self-interested thinking, let alone this is wrong. Why is this wrong? Treating people this way and harassing people, going to another country and harassing people. The list goes on of how you could sit down and break down all the reasons that this type of behavior is bad. There was another person in England who has gotten arrested multiple times and spent time in jail because of his prank videos. And they keep getting more and more extreme. The whole reason these guys are doing this is because of wanting popularity. They've seen other prank videos or channels become popular. And so seeing that popularity, they have a strong desire to get likes and views so that they can become popular. And they are willing to do whatever it takes, and continuing to up the extreme nature of these pranks to where they really are no longer pranks, and filming themselves committing crimes, and all for chasing that views and likes and hoping to become popular because they've seen others do so. And then the peer pressure comes in, because as people are leaving comments and egging them on, that is putting that more and more pressure on them to do that and to continue upping the stakes for what they're doing. And if you are then insulated in this group that appeal to common practice, that where everyone in your group participates in this type of behavior, it then seems that it's acceptable, or at least you don't think about why it might not be seen as okay from the outside perspective. So in this sense, for all three, like I said, I would say those prank, and we'll put prank in quotations because, again, calling it a prank is really not, but that's what they're titling and stuff. That these prank videos that just go to extreme are the best example of how all three of these subtypes are playing into that nature. All right, the next one is stereotypes and biased thinking. So we'll look at stereotyping first. So as it says, stereotypes are generalizations or assumptions that people make about the characteristics of all members of a group based on an image about what individual people in that group are like. This and biased thinking is part of it is that we make these labels to make quick judgments, but then the problem arises when you rely only on those labels, that it leads to the lack of critical thinking and prejudice, and sometimes racism as well. So again, basic stereotyping and biases, we all have them, we all do them. They can be harmless, but the problem is when they're taken to the level of that is how you judge people. That is how you judge one individual based on a group stereotype. You judge people, or in fact move beyond judging to treating people based on biases that you have, rather than it's just one of the tricks that our brain uses to categorize, to label, to put things in order. Our brain likes to have things make sense, and so it part of that is that natural order of things, but people often then take it to being the truth, rather than relying it as a starting point, and then you examine and move further into associating, and then hopefully re-examining when stereotypes are false, when they are clearly like stereotypes that don't have an actual basis in a generalized way, when your biases are impacting your view to critically think, right? It causes us to make incorrect judgments and decisions based on false assumptions, rather than evaluating the situation. And that's the key with that there. So an example with this is, if you think about, and I said a criminal here, if you have a lineup in a police station, and you're told, okay, this person robbed a bank, or they're a criminal in this way, many people have a stereotype of what criminals should look like. And this is in part because of movies and TV that have created this stereotype of the typical criminal, if you will. And then there is an expectation that bad guys should look bad, and that does not play out in regular life. Bad guys come in all shapes and sizes and looks, right? There is no bad guy look. There's people who fit into that stereotypical look, but that doesn't mean that they're the bad guy, right? They're not the criminal who committed this crime. The problem is that this can then have real world impact, in the sense of that you go and, instead of critically thinking about what you saw, or even if it isn't a lineup, just a judgment of a person, and deciding whether you think they're guilty or not. This can be especially damaging for juries if they don't use critical thinking and only focus on this. But then the lineup idea, the idea is that then you may not be able to pick out the person, or the jury then assumes the person is guilty based on whether that person fits into the expectations of a criminal or not, right? And so the wrong person ends up getting picked as the criminal based on these stereotypes and biased thinking. With biased thinking, this is connected to stereotyping, and it's based on our past experiences, emotions, social and cultural influences. Again, this helps us quickly assess situations and make decisions without having to think too hard or analyze the information, which can be beneficial in certain circumstances. But it can also lead to faulty thinking, which is where then the problems come in with this. And this can lead to confirmation bias as well, which is a big thing that is very often something that happens. With confirmation bias and stuff, what this means is essentially we only seek out information that supports our preconceived notion, right? You don't look for other types of what would it be? Other types of beliefs or ideas. Let's see, notion. Sorry, writing and talking. You don't look for other evidence or alternate views. You're only searching for information that supports your pre-existing beliefs. And this can be problematic. And then there's other types of cognitive bias as well. Availability bias is that essentially, we'll just put, I don't have all space for, so I'll just put real, like, 1-2 worded kind of things with this, is immediate examples. So what I mean by this is that we often, with availability bias, it's immediate examples or we'll say lots of examples. We tend to hold things that we have, that we can recollect in our mind, that are available to our mind as examples, to be the true thing. Or if we see a lot of something. So this example or this thing or this idea is available to me and I've heard about it a lot of times, I'm going to hold that in higher regard for making decisions. I make an assumption that essentially this is more likely to be true simply because it's available as like a popular opinion or something that I've seen happen versus something that isn't as frequent. We make assumptions that if we've seen an event take place multiple times, it means it's more likely to happen than the other thing, which isn't necessarily true. It just leaves out a lot of alternate viewpoints and options if you fall into that. Hindsight bias, right, is that the idea of the saying hindsight is 20/20, right? That idea that looking back, it always looks like the answer is obvious, right? Oh, well, of course that is the answer, but that's not necessarily the case in the moment. You don't get the whole picture until things have already happened and the consequences have occurred. And so that can impact future decisions based on what you have seen in the past. It also can inflate your thinking and belief that you make good decisions, because like, well, yeah, duh, I would have picked that too. It's so obvious. Clearly, like, I don't need to break things down and think through the processes and the logic of it, because every time I look at some decision that someone's made in the past, I can see what's wrong with it or why it was a good decision. But you have a much more complex and complete picture once something has taken place and the consequences have happened from that. The framing effect, this is the tendency for the brain to arrive at different conclusions when reviewing info based on how it is presented. So essentially, if it's presented in positive versus negative ways of presenting, we're more likely to pick something if it is presented in a positive way and not consider the other aspects around it. We're more likely to reject something that's presented to us in a negative way. So you can take the same idea, and if you present it to some people in a positive way, they're likely to support it. If you take that exact same idea and present it to other people in a negative way, they're more likely to reject it, right? And then anchoring basis is the idea that we make decisions. We make decisions based off an anchoring idea or point. So based off of an anchor idea. This is that, like, if we have some kind of core idea that is like our guiding, like, idea, essentially that There's some kind of reference point or view, and that is our basis for how we make those decisions. And we always use that as our anchoring point for then making those decisions. The problem is that a lot of times that anchoring point has nothing to do with the decision or problem at hand, right? And that's where it becomes problematic. And then bandwagon effect is that our behaviors and decisions are based on what other people do, right? That's the popularity one too, right? If everyone else is doing it, then I'm making that decision based on that, right? This list isn't comprehensive. It doesn't include like all of the other biases and stuff that can affect our decision, right? Race, ethnicity, language, age, economic status, etc. All of those things can play a role too. These are more based on the kind of cognitive aspects of it, but there's tons, and so you could have pages and pages of these lists. All of these things come into play though and influence our thinking based on previous experiences and circumstances. Ultimately the end thing is the key is to recognize that. There's a whole process of acknowledge your biases. This isn't a bad thing. We all have them. It's, can you recognize when they are influencing your thinking, right? And if you can, it can help you then make better critical thinking decisions. The next is cognitive overload, mental fatigue. Ultimately, when we're busy and we're tired or there's too many things going on at the same time, we're more likely to make mistakes. We're more likely to fail to critically think. This also has a massive impact on our emotional, physical well-being and mental well-being too. You see this a lot talked about with doctors and nurses, which is the worst place to do this. They force, attendees to work like 16, 18-hour shifts, sometimes longer. They're having to learn a ton of new stuff while doing a ton of tasks. And it is so easy to end up with fatigue and cognitive overload, which is exactly what you don't want doctors and nurses in the hospitals having, because then they stop critically thinking or they make small mistakes that if they just didn't have that overload, that those mistakes wouldn't have taken place because they could have rationally thought through the whole process. And so you see it a lot talked about in there. There's been huge discussions about whether like the culture and way that's run needs to be changed. But obviously it impacts the average person as well. Because essentially, and this is where, again, the example of the gorilla or bear walking through while you're counting the basketball passes is a good example of also cognitive overload, because you're being asked to do all of these things at the same time. And so because your brain is doing so many different things, it doesn't recognize and see the thing it doesn't expect, which is where the mistakes then come into play with this process. Scams and propaganda massively take advantage of that. Scams, what they'll do is once they got you on the hook, it sometimes is the initial thing. If you're super busy, you're stressed out, and you get a quick text that says, hey, your cell phone service is going to be canceled for no payment, something important, right? Or hey, this $2,000 purchase was debited out of your bank account. You freak out because, again, they work on the emotional, and then they work on this idea of mental fatigue and cognitive overload. They do that. But the first thing they actually do is get you on the emotional. So you freak out, which then starts stressing you out. And so you make the first mistake of clicking on the link or calling that number. Once they get you on the phone, it moves to step 2, where they have you doing a bunch of different things. They make sure that you don't talk to other people. Anytime you start to question or critically think, they shut it down so that you end up going along with this structure. And because you are now stressed, because you are now busy, because they are isolating you and stopping you from critically thinking, you then are more likely to go through with the scam, right? Propaganda tries to push it in almost the same way. It's just not in real time, right? The way that propaganda is being given to you is that they try to do it if you are, it's just more effective, essentially. If they have you when you're busy and tired, if they have you when you're stressed, your brain, it's one more function that just becomes harder to do, right? So things to think about for how to address this, right? Stop and remember to consider the information carefully. Recognize when you're stressed, right? That's the first step. But then stop and say, okay, I actually need to consider the information carefully. I am stressed and I'm trying to do 20 things at once, and I can't stop and think about all these things right now. So you don't make decisions when you are in that aspect of mental fatigue, right? That's a good part, is don't make decisions. I don't know why I keep how that keeps coming up. When you have mental fatigue, right, or are busy. If tons of things are going on, you need to recognize, like, I shouldn't be making this decision right now. It requires a close look. You don't take the information at face value. This is, again, with those scams. They get people, and propaganda. They get people who just accept what is being told to them because they are stressed, because they are cognitively overloaded. Consider multiple perspectives or evidence. Recognize incorrect information is being presented to you. This is really hard if the other is happening, right? That takes being able to recognize that you need to stop. That, like, basically, I would argue that this is only available to do sometimes if you just don't make that decision when you're stressed and busy. And then be able to recognize when you have cognitive overload and mental fatigue. If you feel stressed, if you feel like you have a billion things to do, that should be your clue to not make serious decisions. Or if it's something where someone sends you a text that says this thing is happening and you know it's happening, like, okay, I have to make this decision now. Stop for a second and say, oh, let me look this over. What would be the rational way if it says that my bank, that this has happened? Instead of clicking on this link, I can go in my bank account and log in directly there and check, right? This says this happened in Amazon. Let me check in the Amazon or log into my iTunes and see, and to the Apple, right? Your Apple ID, and see if this thing actually took place. Before you click on a link, before you call that number, you can check, but people often don't think to do that step because they caught them when they were busy, and then they created a stressful situation with the event. All right, the last one then is the philosophical obstacles. This is the worldview ones, right? This is the how you think kind of thing. Right, this is that aspect of how you see your worldview, how you interpret the world with that, or this is the what with that, the how. The how is the what you perceive, but it's that worldview system of this, and then there's other ones besides this, but these are some of them, and the idea with these is that if you have certain views of how the world works, that alone can impede your critical thinking. These are 3 philosophical viewpoints that you can learn in other philosophy classes that often are an impediment to critical thinking. The first is subjective relativism. It's the idea that truth depends on what someone believes. The truth is relative to each person. Right? That means an idea or proposition can be true for one person and not for another. This statement is, well, that is my belief. Right? Or truth. I think they actually, when people use this statement, they say that's my truth. Right? Or they'll use, this statement is true for me. That's one you hear all the time. This statement is true for me. Anytime you hear this, right, they're using subjective relativism. And critical thinking has not got into it. That it's an excuse to say, well, it's all relative, right? This is my truth and that's your truth. The alternate facts is also another one that is coming off of that idea as well. There's not alternate facts. It doesn't work. But I've heard so many times people say this statement is true for me, or that's my truth. This is my truth. Critical thinking is looking to actually get to what is true, what is objective. And what's the idea, right? The whole point of critical thinking is about determining what is true. What is the best decision to make? You can't do that if there is no concrete truth. If all truth is relative, then there is no point for critical thinking, right? But obviously that's not how the world is set up, because essentially with the subjective relativism, whatever choice you make is the right choice for you because it's your truth. It could be the wrong choice for everyone else, but that's on them, versus looking at it from a more objective perspective. Social relativism is truth is relative to societies. So truth is not about an individual's belief, but society's beliefs as a whole. So this could be the idea that what a claim is true for Americans, but not Germans. Right? True for college students, but not working adults, and so on and so on. Now, you could put generalities, like you would say, like, it's very common that Americans do this and Germans don't. And that's fine, but it's this idea that you hold, instead of having, like, it is individual truth is whatever a person is, right? It's that whatever societies do as a group is therefore correct. Because that's the society's truth. So essentially it's this, right? This statement is our society's truth, right? That's kind of how that would go. The problem with this is this completely ignores the whole problem that you could justify misinformation and horrible acts that are supported by a larger society. I mean, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust would be an example of that. Now, not everyone in Germany believed that, but the larger society supported Hitler and the process. And so technically under social relativism, well, that's Germany's truth at the time. Obviously not now, during Hitler's time, right? And that then is true for them and acceptable for them because that's their relative truth. It doesn't work, right? There's objectively things that are wrong and right. But there are definitely philosophical beliefs that and the thought experiment and the theory of thinking come out that are problematic if you then incorporate this into your worldview. What's the point of critical thinking then? And lastly, skepticism, which does the same thing. Skepticism, again, these are very short examples here of what each of these are. But skepticism is the idea that we know very little. That's the moderate view. The extreme view of skepticism is that we don't know anything except that we know nothing. It's the statement there. The only thing I know is that I know nothing. Everything else is relative. We cannot know for certain. And this is the key, certainty. If I can write. So certainty, right, or conclusively is the other one with it. If we don't know for certain something, then we can't know. The problem with that is that it's kind of like reasonable doubt and stuff like that. You could always argue that we are not 100% sure on certain things, right? Can I know 100% that this table is real? Well, no. What if it is in my mind? I can have all these arguments for why, but there's that tiny little thing that suggests maybe I don't know for sure that this is really here. Am I really here? Right? You could get into this big thing of like, we don't know for sure. Do I know that this is reality? Well, here's all the reasons why I think it is. And they have all these good, critical thinking things that back it up. But there is that sliver of doubt. Essentially, if there is this idea that any doubt whatsoever, no matter how small, it's not conclusive, and therefore we can't know. So that's why you get the statement, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. That's the only thing I can say with certainty. Everything else, you have to be. A healthy dose of skepticism, like, this can be good. In fact, critical thinking requires skepticism, that you stop and you think about. You don't take at face value what someone is telling you, right? That's fine. Basic skepticism, but the worldview and philosophy of skepticism as a philosophy of thought moves into that more non-critical thinking territory, where essentially you reject reasonable claims just because of the small possibility that you may be wrong or that it may not be true, right? That's where it becomes problematic with it. But of course, skepticism is a central aspect of critical thinking. So it is important to separate those two, right? Just basic skepticism is good. Worldview of skepticism as a philosophy of thought of how the world works to the extreme, not good in that sense. All right, I apologize. I'm probably going to say this every time for the longer video. They always go longer than I hope they will. But I hope you found that interesting and got some good information on that and can think about these in terms of these are things that we see every day and experience every day in our life. How do we make sure the little things, they don't matter so much, right? But how do we make sure that they don't become barriers to critical thinking when they become bigger things? And just even being aware of how often you do these things can help you start thinking about acknowledging and considering them when you're making decisions. And as we're looking through this process of critical thinking, keeping these in the back of your mind as part of that. So there we go. Have a good rest of the day.